So today we're going to be talking about taking risks. What does it really mean to take a risk? Well, if you were somebody who smoked cigarettes your whole life, you have a risk of getting cancer. If you know it or not, you do have that risk. And unfortunately, that happened in my family. And to be honest with you, many people today are taking risk in one way or another. One of the ways that they take a risk is by saying, I'm just going to risk it that God doesn't exist. They're saying to themselves, well, I don't believe that God exists, so I'm just going to take that risk that, you know what? If he does exist, well, I'll deal with that then. But what's the point of that? Because what do you have to lose? If God exists, right? And okay, actually no. If God doesn't exist, right? Even though we know he exists. If God doesn't exist, right? And in your mind, you believe that God exists. You take that risk and say, I'm going to believe that God exists. And in the end, you find out God didn't exist. What did you lose? You didn't lose anything. Why? Because you learned a lot of good values, right? You learned patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control, all these things. So again, taking a risk with that, there's no, like, the risk outweigh the reward here, you know? And it's like, honestly, like, you just saying, hey, God exists. I think that's great because you know what? You're taking a risk that many people aren't willing to take. And unfortunately, many people are like, you know, I'll just take the risk that God doesn't exist and that there's no way that he could ever exist. And if he does exist, you know, no, taking the risk that God exists is beautiful because you know what? You learned all those amazing qualities. Now, we know that God exists. Of course, I am a theist who believes that God exists, and I am a Christian theist, meaning that I follow Christianity, but again, God does exist. Now, again, you're going to say, well, what if he doesn't exist? And, you know, like I said before, but again, if he doesn't exist, again, you learn great qualities. It doesn't really, you know, matter in that case because you learn good stuff anyways. There's no risk to following God. The only risk that you were taking, literally, would be to not follow him. Because if you don't follow him and in the end you find out he was true and that he did exist, you're going to be like, oh, crap, like this God did exist. And now I have no chance because at the end, it's the end. You have no chance to say, hey, God, I believe you exist now. Like, he's like, okay, well, I gave you a bunch of chances out there. You know, the Bible literally says that creation points to creator. If you go to Romans, it literally says that. It says that all creation points to a creator. So again, we really don't have an excuse. But again, you're going to say, well, what if the people don't understand, you know, they see evolution and all these things, but it's like, I'd rather take the risk believing that God started everything versus just saying evolution appeared on its own because honestly, it's a bigger risk to believe that God doesn't exist because if he does exist and he comes and tells you at the very end when you're face to face with him that he didn't exist, you're like, oh, I'd much rather go and be that time and there be nothing there and say, okay, well, you know, I took that risk versus there being something there and him telling me, you know, you didn't believe in me and you're like, whoa, this is like really serious here. And again, I also want to bring up that with the charismatic movement because many people today will claim they hear from God or they speak directly for God. And I say to that, like, why take the risk of that? Because there's a 50-50% chance that God is real. Okay, we can do that too. But there's a 50-50% chance that you are speaking directly for God, that God is actually speaking to you. Why take that risk that God is speaking to you? Because, again, in the end, it's the same thing as the atheist. If God comes to you and says, hey, look, I wasn't speaking to you, you would feel like, oh, this is so bad. You would feel horrible. But again, at that point, you have no chance to repent fully because, again, you could say, God, I'm sorry. But again, it's the end. There's no chance at the end of anything changing. You're not on earth where you can just make a conscious choice to change and, you know, repent and God will forgive that. Once it's the end, it's the end. It's the same thing with the atheist, right? So again, you are taking a risk. Like, you're dying on a hill that's pretty risky, regardless of, you know, if it's believing God exists or you believe you're a prophet or something like that. Because again, Mormons today, if you're a Mormon right now and I'm speaking to you, you are taking a risk just by believing Joseph Smith's a prophet. It's the same thing if you're, you know, in the charismatic movement of Christianity. Why die on a hill that's really risky? Because again, we know what Jesus says in the end in Matthew chapter 7, right? He says to those people, I never knew you. Would you rather take the risk that God says I didn't know you? Because again, it's a risk, and you're going to say, well, I'll take that risk because I truly believe what God has shown me, right? Either I believe that God has proven the Book of Mormon true to me, or God has said prophetic messages to me, or I have so much undeniable evidence that there isn't a God. Whatever it is, you're taking a huge risk by doing that because again, it's easier, in my opinion at least, to just take that risk that God is true or that God isn't speaking to me like I think he is, than to actually go ahead and believe what I already believe. Because in the end, if it ends up being true that you were wrong, that's a really, really, really big, dangerous path to go down. You don't want to hear, I never knew you from God, regardless of if you didn't believe in him from point blank or you thought you knew him and he didn't know you. And that's a really big risk. I'd much rather there be nothing there They'd be just a black empty hole and say, okay, I learned all these great qualities and great attributes, even though there was no God. Of course, I believe there's a God, but I'm saying in the rare 0% chance that there wasn't, again, I would much rather be in that position of saying, okay, well, I didn't lose anything because, again, you gained all these qualities. Now, again, I'm going to go back to the prophet example. If you believe God is speaking directly to you today, why take that risk every day thinking it's him? You say, well, no, they're undeniably, I know it's him. How do you know it's him for sure? Because what about when Jesus talks to us in Matthew chapter 24, and he literally says that there are people going to come in his name. You don't want to be that example where you came in his name saying, I am he. Why take that risk thinking that you may be him? Because there's a 50% chance that you are him. You are that person that Jesus is talking about. So why die on that hill? It makes no sense. Why die on that hill? Because it's a big risk to take to die on a hill that says God doesn't exist, or, I am speaking directly for God. Because again, we can go back to the cancer situation that I said in the beginning. You are taking a risk every time you smoke a cigarette. Think about that, literally. Or even people who have alcoholism. You could be having sclerosis of the liver, literally. Like, so many things could happen. Every choice that we make has a consequence. Even though you may not know it or not, like the smoker right now may not know that. Or the person who's heavily addicted to alcohol is not going to really realize that when they're so deep in the addiction. And again, the same thing probably for you with your belief systems. You're so deeply engrossed in these belief systems, it's really hard to pull you out of that. But again, thinking about it, it's so much easier to just say, you know what, I'm not going to take that risk. Because if I take that risk and I'm wrong in the end, there's dangerous consequences. Something to think about, and I just pray that this video really sinks deep into you. And if you're an atheist, I highly suggest you come check out some of the other videos I have here on this channel. It is wonderful videos. I really think they're great because my atheist father has watched a lot of them, and he says that it really has encouraged him, even though he doesn't believe the same way that I believe. So I hope that these videos on this channel are here to encourage you. That's literally my whole deal here. God really led me to make these videos for you who are questioning God's existence. So I pray that this video specifically really hits home, and peace be with you.